I wear many hats, as Nick pointed out, but the hat I wear today is as President of the International Science Council. And I want to just start by telling you a little bit about it, because I think it's important if we're going to have a partnership between the science community and the science publishing community that we understand the voices on each side of the discussion which needs to be held. We're, in one sense, young, only 4 years old. In another sense, we're very old, over 100 years old, because we were formed 4 years ago by the merger of the International Scientific Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, and which was the body representing natural sciences, and the International Social Science Council, which had been set up by UNESCO after the Second World War. As you might imagine, our job has been in some ways to integrate the thinking about the natural and the social sciences, and we range right from the political sciences at one end of the spectrum to cosmology at the other end of the spectrum. Our membership is the membership of the World Scientific Academies, the disciplinary bodies such as the International Mathematical Union or the International Astronomical Union or the International Political Science Association. We're active in probably 140, 150 countries. And we also have a number of affiliated bodies, some of which you might be surprised to recognise that they're part of this complex network in the international science horizon, ranging from the Standing Committee or the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which coordinates Antarctic research, to the World Climate Research Programme, which is a partnership between us and the World Meteorological Organization, so into very specific areas of existential risk, to Future Earth, which some of you will have heard of in the environmental space, to the International Network for Government Science Advice, which Nick just mentioned before. So it's a very extensive body encompassing really the bulk of the scientific community, primarily in the public sector around the world, directly and indirectly. Its headquarters are in Paris, and as I live in New Zealand, allegedly, you can imagine the rather interesting amount of time I'm spending commuting. Its mission statement is undergoing revision, but it's very simple. We're the global voice for and of science. And in that, we represent science in the multilateral system, and indeed that's our increasingly primary role, is working with UN agencies, with the UN itself. Just last week I signed a major MOU with the World Health Organization's Director General, and that is becoming increasingly important as it's quite clear that the multilateral system has its challenges, to say the least. And science needs to be better incorporated into the decision-making processes of the international policy community. And so our primary role on one hand is this, of trying to work on behalf of the global science community with those who influence global policy. But on the other, we need to also look inwards. And looking inwards, we need to also look to you. Because at the end of the day, we need to think about the future of science. Science itself is evolving. And a lot of what the ISC, and particularly Matt Denis, wherever Matt is, will have a major role in our revised organisation in leading discourse and reflection on how the science system will evolve over the next few years. It will not look the same in 10 or 20 years' time to how it looks now. And I'll come back to that. In our international role, we've seen in the last little while the big conflict in Ukraine. And that for the ISC was very interesting and awkward because, of course, not awkward, challenging, because what were we going to do? We have Russian Academy members, we have American Academy members, and so forth. And the scientific community looked to us for leadership. And we made the choice early on that we would not expel the Russians or the Belarusian members from our academy, from our organisation, because it is inevitable that science will be an important part of healing the divisions once and if the conflict resolves. And in doing so, I want to go back into history. If you think about what happened in the first Cold War, because sadly I think we're going to have to start talking about the First and the Second Cold War now, science was critical in the First Cold War. Some of the biggest successes of diplomacy of the First Cold War came from science. In 1957, my predecessor organisation, ICSU, launched the International Geophysical Year, which was a year focused on combined international science to study both the Van Allen belt, the radiation sector, but particularly the polar regions, and particularly the Antarctic. That was the first time there had really been a coordinated look at the polar south, and that led 2 years later to what many would regard as the highlight of science diplomacy. The signing of the Antarctic Treaty, initially by 27 countries, now by more than 60 countries, maybe 70 countries, to dedicate the whole of the Antarctic region below 60 degrees south to scientific, for peaceful purposes, which effectively means science with a little bit of tourism. That's lasted all that time unbroken, and is in many ways seen to be the highlight. It was led by the science community. In 1985, my predecessor organisation, along with others, organised what was called the Villach Conference. That conference was the first time the climate scientists of the world had come together to say the world is warming. But the scientists went further than that at that meeting. They demanded that some multilateral policy organisation was set up to address climate change. That's the origin of the IPCC. I could go on and on and on how science has led diplomatic initiatives in the First Cold War. And it's almost certain that our organisation will have to do the same in what's coming now. We live in a complex world. We all know that. It's multipolar. The emergence of all these new technologies mean that misinformation, malinformation, disinformation is influencing decisions that are made. And at the same time, we face existential risks of massive proportions. I've mentioned climate change, biodiversity loss, social cohesion loss, the epidemic of mental health, particularly in young people, food, water, and energy issues. The list goes on and on and on. And dealing with these global commons issues is becoming the number one threat of our times. It's not easy. And within that, one of the major activities of the ISC has been to establish a commission to look at the big gap. If we're honest, and we think about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's lots of science that claims to be relevant to the SDGs. Scientists are very good at shifting their grant applications to fit the signals are set. Your market, you know your business too. Well, scientists are running a business too. It's called getting money. But in fact, when you look at the application to actually translatable, actionable knowledge, the effect has been rather dismal. There are many reasons for that, and it's not easy, and today is not the day to go into that in any detail, except to say that new modalities of research are going to be needed. They're going to need co-design. They're going to need to involve stakeholders, whether they be citizens or policymakers. They're going to need disciplines that are far broader than those that are normally brought to bear. Doesn't matter how much climate science we do. It's nice to know what's going to happen to the glaciers. Well, it's not nice to know, but we need to know what's going to happen to the glaciers in 2200 or sea level rise in 2300. But what we don't know is how to persuade, what's the science of decision-making, which means that so many policymakers defer action on climate change, or why citizens choose to ignore the evidence and don't take choices of their own. And I spoke about this at COP26, the need to see a broader range of science addressed to these existential questions, and it's particularly the social sciences of behaviour and emotion and risk assessment that become key. Obviously, and so to do that, we've set up a commission headed by Irina Bukova, the former head of UNESCO, and Helen Clark, the former administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, with many distinguished scientists, philanthropists, and statespeople to try and design what a new model for delivering that kind of research, which is desperately needed, might be. More on that early next year. The other area we obviously work on, which does parallel and integrate with you, and we need to think about where the points of intersection might be, is our long-standing Committee on Freedom and Responsibility of Science. That we probably are the most influential body in the world, or we like to think so anyhow, in how science looks at itself in terms of integrity and responsibility. And given that your organisation thinks so much about integrity in science, and I'll come back to that as well, perhaps we need to talk more about where the points of intersection are in what is a very complex situation where it's easy to state things in black and white, but actually trying to get processes that are robust is important. In that, we also do something else which sometimes is very hard, which is fight to support the interests of scientists who've been locked up somewhere because of their scientific statements, not because of their political activities. And that's a very sensitive and difficult area that takes a lot of time within our organisation. So moving on to the substantive bit of my talk, although I've probably run out of time already, Nick, I want to talk about our partnership, or the need for partnership. Trust in science is essential, and both you as publishers and we as scientists must strive to enhance it. And we need to be honest that it's not easy. The world out there is not trusting of science as it was for a variety of reasons. And there are changes that are going to be needed. And so what I'm going to do in my remarks is talk about the two major components of public science. And I'm going to call them both industries. Just the industry that you represent, that is the publishing industry, and the industry of doing public science, which is the industry I represent, and how they relate to each other. I'm going to be rather frank and self-critical, but hopefully pragmatically. But before we go there, I think it's really critical that we have a joint understanding of what the word science means. I think that's got lost in this discussion. If you don't start about having a clear view of what science is, then you can't make the right choices about how to frame what we do and what we should. The modern understanding of science has evolved a long way since the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and since the rather narrow Popperian view of falsibility or Kuhn's views of disruption. Philosophers of science are now very clear in defining science by characteristics that make it a distinct form of knowledge, one that is systematically organised, is subject to the scrutiny of peers, and is rationally explicable. That defines sciences, those four common things. Systematically organised knowledge, subject to the scrutiny of peers, rationally explicable. And no other explanations, such as tradition, belief, or the supernatural, are permitted. And because science is defined in this way, and not by any other characteristics, science is not a fixed knowledge system, but one of self-correcting and evolving. And we've got to be honest. If you looked back at medicine of the early 19th century, you wouldn't have called it scientific. It's really only the advances that Flexner brought in at the beginning of the 20th century that turned medicine to having any scientific basis whatsoever. And you can look at other domains of science, particularly in the social sciences, and see also that that science evolves if it's defined in these terms. But the critical thing for today's discourse is that this working definition places the open record and the open scrutiny of peers central to defining science. You can't have science without publication. So you're critical, not just to your industry, but critical to what is science and what is not science. But there are big buts in that last statement, and I'm going to return to those buts momentarily. But first, let me reflect on the conduct of my industry before I make some comments on your industry. Over the last 77 years, since Vannevar Bush published his seminal report, The Endless Frontier, countries have invested more and more of their taxpayers' funds in science to get a variety of economic, technological, military, health, and perhaps to a lesser extent environmental and social outcomes. And because I'm rather old, I can reflect back on the past. In my early career in the 1970s, the industry of academia was small, and the incentives on both sides of these two industries were rather straightforward. The volume of papers published was small, published in a little booklet called Current Contents, which probably nobody else in this room has ever had to read. Came out once a week, you put a little circle around the papers you were interested in. If they weren't in the library, you sent out a postcard to the author to get a copy, which you may or may not have got as a preprint. The number of journals one might publish in any field was small. I only had to think about 10 journals in my career as a biomedical scientist. Nothing else counted. I didn't need metrics. I knew the rank order. I was an endocrinologist. I knew the rank order of papers in the field. If you got into the Journal of Endocrinology, it was great. If you didn't, you tried the Journal of Endocrinology and you went down the list. It was simple. And there was no need for metrics at all. There were no metrics. And then Eugene Garfield, the publisher of Current Contents, then decided to start us down the road in ISI on the pathway to applying metrics. And so a new disease was born, the bibliometric disease. And as tertiary education grew in the 1980s, with the emergence of spin-out companies, especially in the life sciences, in the digital sciences, the science enterprise grew rapidly. Countries invested more and more in universities. You saw the red bricks become universities in the UK, for example, and more countries and a much more diverse range of individuals from those countries started to engage in the global enterprise of science. But while the bibliometric disease might have started small, it didn't get walled off with lockdowns, but soon became a pandemic, and a rather virulent pandemic. Universities started using metrics, somewhat naively, performance management. It was a lot easier to count up the number of papers or citations an academic had done than to interview them and see where their career was going and so forth. For promotion assessment, for tenure decisions, institutions encouraged the use of metrics and pseudometrics and rankings for their reputational enhancement. And so you have the great ranking games of universities, which is totally out of control. And in some places, staff were and still are financially rewarded for publishing in a so-called high-impact journal. Think of the incentives that were coming into play. Then governments saw this proxy data as a way to performance manage their higher education institutions they've always had trouble managing. And I better be careful because I chair the External Advisory Board for the review of the UK research assessment exercise. So I better be careful what I say. But a very mixed range of incentives emerged. And where there are incentives, and all of you who are business people know, there are inevitably opportunities, and quite understandably they'll be taken by the actors, but those opportunities lead to outcomes which are not always necessarily benign. Impact factors, citation rates, H-indices, altmetrics became the language of the interface between the interlocked industries, our two interlocked industries. Increasingly, individual scientists sought more proxy points, through deciding where to publish and how to publish, their peers and how much to publish, and their careers depended on how their employers and their funders saw it. And so a feed-forward loop was created, in which H indices and impact factors determine not just peer esteem, but funding and employment. And as the assessment of performance and quality is inherently subjective, I don't know what excellent research is. I don't know what highly impactful research is. In general, I might see a bit of work in retrospect and know how good, important it was. But looking at it in real time and knowing what it's going to mean is not so easy. And think of somebody like Barbara McClintock and her work that got her the Nobel Prize. There was 40 years between her finding of what was good and anybody thinking it was more than just an oddball discovery. There's big issues here. But yet the community wants to use these apparently objective measures to do something that's inherently subjective. And that's where conflict comes. All of you who deal with peer review know how difficult peer review is. You'll get 2 reviewers that say it's the greatest piece on earth, and you'll get 1 that says it's rubbish, or 1 that says it's great, and 2 that says it's rubbish. Those of you who deal with that part of the system know how hard it is, and yet we regard that as the gold standard. There's some real deep issues here that are hard to get to the bottom of, because again, as I said, science depends on this open and critical, constructive evaluation by peers of what's done. It's bloody complicated. And I refer you to the recent book, The Quantified Scholar by Pardo Guerrero, a book that everybody should read on this subject, which highlights how this culture's had so many spillover consequences, not just on how science is communicated or on the career paths of scientists, but on what science has actually done and how disciplines of science are becoming more homogeneous within themselves rather than promoting the diversity that's necessary if we're to explore the world around and within us. And so there are real issues on my side of the camp. But the publishing industry also fed off this opportunity. Your ability to exploit what was going on understandably grew. But with unpaid and generally unrecognised editors and unpaid reviewers, peer reviewers, authors in many ways continue to pay for the privilege of publishing. And this, as you know, has become for many a source of discontent. It depends on which country and what deals have been done over open science. But for many people, open science has meant my research budget is compromised because if I choose to publish in that journal with an APC, that's less money for my research. So it depends on the context. In Europe, more advanced than elsewhere, there are real issues. Open science is, of course, critical. It comes back to my definition of science. We need everybody to see the knowledge. They need to see the data. They need to have access to it. And in a world that is globalised, albeit fractured, it's critical. And I think we know that open science is changing the world of science, empowering scholars of the global south to be more engaged in the enterprise. But the model that's developed is just shifting where costs lie. And that's a huge, and again, it varies across countries. But that one particular issue continues to drive a lot of tension. And so in this interacting set of feedback loops, the business of making money continues, and I understand that. Private enterprise is good. But we also saw in this world the emergence of predatory journals, which pretend and deceive so many, particularly from the global south. It's a huge issue. The scientific record is being corrupted by these journals. Peer review is non-existent, whatever's claimed. Naive people, naive in a nice sense of the word, but people new to the science system are being harassed, being conned, and it's doing nobody any good. But at the same time, within the more mainstream part of the industry, we've also seen the emergence of many lesser journals. Large screeds of journals where the authorship is small, the range of readership is very small, the discipline is somewhat obscure, and again, the begging for journal articles, one more article please, then we can publish another volume of it, is just epidemic. I would get at least one request a day for a paper. And so the boundary between a truly predatory journal and one that is not as clear as you might think it is. And we all know, and I'm not going to be critical of any of you in this room by name, but we all know that even major publishers have journals of lesser quality and doubtful integrity within their stable. And I would wonder whether there's not a real place for a joint effort between our community and your community to think better about what's happening here, because we're doing nobody any good by hundreds of journals that nobody's ever heard of, putting people into very difficult positions over where do they publish and what do they publish and how do they publish. I face this issue in my other job, which we didn't talk about, which is Scientific Director of the Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences, every week of young scientists wanting to know where to publish and trying to balance between available funding, desperate to get a paper out, salami slicing because there are incentives to produce lots of papers, and they're putting in front of me names of journals I've never heard of, would never want to, and have a most uncertain readership. So all the time in that role, when I'm still active, which is not very often, it's balancing the need between impact, ego and reputation on one hand, against budget, research needs, team development, etc., etc. So where to publish and how to publish has become not just a communication choice, but a complex financial, social, and people management choice. It's really bloody hard. At the same time, new models of publishing are emerging. For example, we saw, particularly during COVID, the rush to preprints. Preprints are great if they're peer-reviewed, but how many preprints never make it beyond being effectively an egotistical statement? I think I've found something. Here it is on the web. We're working in the ISC quite a lot on the issues of how do we improve the reliability of preprints, peer review, etc., etc., etc. And again, there's an obvious point for partnership here, because depending on how the preprint industry emerges or develops will determine the fate of scientific publishing into the future. And therefore, the protection of that open critique of science and its validation by scrutiny by peers becomes so important. I'm probably out of date because I haven't talked to Elsevier or Clarivate recently, but I guess last year there were about 3.5 million scientific papers and about 40,000 journals. Most of those papers will not be cited or ever used. And their primary value, if we're honest, is only to their authors. Of course, some of that high volume is valid. For example, an early stage researcher or research of primary local relevance. But the volume of papers of low quality impact being published even from high income countries suggests these deeper issues related to the incentives in this disease which Eugene Garfield let loose on the world. And despite DORA and the other like-minded declarations, the very institutions that sign up to avoid these measures use them all the time, at least implicitly, if not explicitly. And at the same time, science is evolving rapidly. We've seen the emergence of big data science, of transdisciplinary science, which I'll come back to in a moment. And both these systems need their outlets to make science an open record. It's becoming critically important that the data sets that are the future of science are not locked up behind paywalls in ways that eliminate or exclude scientists from using them, albeit that there needs to be protections on these systems for ethical and other related reasons I may come back to. But I'm not sure that the funding system, the publication system that serve this area has yet worked out what we should do around this whole area of data sets. But I want to talk a little bit about transdisciplinarity, because I don't think this is the other major endeavour in science which your industry and my industry have not confronted properly. Transdisciplinarity is the new wave of research, particularly that wave of research which is going to focus on the existential issues such as the sustainability challenges. It requires a new way of doing research. It's not just the scientists coming up with a hypothesis, testing it. It's about co-design with the stakeholders, be them policymakers or the community, and the co-design process is actually where the methodology is worked through. What is the question, what is the approach, and how do you do it? And the research has always got an actionable outcome. So it's very different in its nature. By its very nature, it involves multiple disciplines and domains, not only from science. It may involve indigenous knowledge, it may involve tacit knowledge, it will involve local knowledge, it will involve, obviously, multiple disciplines of science, and critically, they must not come to the table with their views, with one view already predetermining what the science should look like. But it's the science that's going to take us through the sustainability challenges. It's harder to decide how to fund it, how to assess it, and it's basically got nowhere to publish it. Of all the areas of science, most important, because it needs new forms of peer review, including extended peer review, not just by scientists themselves. It needs scientific review as well, because often it seems to be in local context, even though it may be of global importance, because the example will be from mangrove swamps in Jamaica or whatever. We need a new model of publishing this. And I say to the major publishers in this room, if there's one thing you could do for science, looking ahead, it is to have a discussion with us, seriously, about the needs of transdisciplinary research, because it's the most important research, yet it has no vehicles for outlet other than in a minor journal, because it's assumed that it's something local when it's not. So I would challenge you, my point is, and I could say the same thing about the evidence to policy interface, but in the interest of time I won't. This issue of actionable research is where you and we need to talk together. So the definition of science I started with, and which frames the whole way I think about our interface between your industry and mine, is about open science, scrutiny of our peers. And I'm not going to spend time on peer review now, except I think we all know it's in trouble. We know it's overloaded, we know it's overburdened by volume, the quality of it is highly variable. You exploit it, but you need it. We need it, but it's not recognised in our institutions as a service function. We must think about how we can find new models of peer review. There are things that can be done automatically, there are things that cannot. And we need to work together on it, because I don't think it's good enough that the publisher or a publisher defines how they will do peer review without the proper engagement with. You are the mouthpiece of science, but science needs to have some say on how the mouthpiece is actually the voice that's used. And I think there's a critical need here for honest discussion about the future shape of peer review. Once Dame Bridget Ogilvie, the former director of the Wellcome Trust in its heyday, when receiving an honorary doctorate from the University of Auckland, spoke to a simple aphorism: bad science is a waste of money. What defines bad science? Is it the scientists? Is it our industry? Is it your industry? Or is it the folly of our two? And I think that's the kind of discussion we need to think about. We need to reflect on whether this complex interplay between our two industries is doing the best for science, or is at times damaging science, and in particular reducing or enhancing its value to society. We must ask this question, even if we're biased towards the optimistic rather than the pessimistic end of the range of answers, because the world needs science more than ever. And we must work much harder to ensure greater trust, not more cynicism about the role of science. There's not one aspect of the human and planetary condition that does not depend on science, be it climate change, conflict, mental health, environmental degradation. And if we look back at those principles that define science that I used at the beginning of my talk, then we need a robust system of ensuring that knowledge is open and subject to scrutiny. That's why at our last General Assembly last year, the International Science Council established some principles to inform how science and science publishing must co-evolve. You might see them as stated as somewhat idealistic, but while they may be idealistic goals, we need to find pragmatic solutions and partnerships to addressing them. I'm not going to dwell on them in length because I suspect you all have seen them, and if you haven't, I encourage you to look at the ISC website, because there's a statement by the science community of what it thinks science publication needs to do. Clearly, there must be universal, prompt and open access to the record of science for all the actors with no barriers, and we've talked about that, and I don't need to spend time on it. And that means, secondly, we need open licenses to permit reuse, use and text and data mining. And again, that's work that's a long way from being complete. Thirdly, I've talked about peer review, which must be at the heart of the system, but needs strengthening. Fourthly, the data on which truth claims are made needs to be available at the same time the claims are made. And that's something which I know a number of you have been working on, but it's a huge challenge, and it's not as easy as it sounds, because there are issues and some situations of general access needing to be restricted because of safety, security, ethical and private concerns. But we do have the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, which are beginning to define how data repositories should operate. Fifthly, and this may be not as important as you may think, well, I think it is important, but the technologies of publishing change. I grew up, most of my work was done before the internet existed. The journals of paper record, which were important to me in my work, are largely still inaccessible. A lot of them don't exist on the web. And it's only in big old filing cabinets you can find this stuff. So young people go and redo work which was already resolved 30, 40, 50 years ago. But your records will change too. The technology of the future will not be the technology of today. So we've got a technology challenge to think about how we sustain the record of science into the future. Sixthly, welcomely, science now extends into 180, 190 countries in the world. Half the world's population is now able to engage in science, which is not before. Ethnicities, beyond gender, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity is growing in science. How do we actually ensure that all their work is accessible, particularly when it's not necessarily published in English? And that's a challenge which I think technology could solve in the near future. How will you develop and sustain the record when the paper journal will disappear altogether? How do we protect? I like the paper journal because it's the way I like to scribble on the side, and I'm still struggling to use these sorts of things. But that's not the case in the future, and so the paper journal may disappear altogether, and we need to think about that. But the one point I want to end on, which I think hopefully is an optimistic point, is we need to find a path such that the governance of the processes of the dissemination of science knowledge becomes accountable to the science community as well as being delivered by your industry. It's our key tool. It defines what science is. And yet the incentives in play have created deep issues between both industries, the industry of science, the industry of publishing, and put a tension between us. Science must be a global good. Systems can only change when we look at the underlying incentives, and there's so many stakeholders. We don't have to agree on everything as scientists and publishers, but I think we can agree that the primary role of our two industries is to develop and disseminate knowledge for the global good. And if that's the case, then a partnership will be key to science progressing as a trusted means of understanding better the world around and within us. Only with trust can science make its promised contributions to the existential challenges of the futures. I'm not naive. I know that we've got different drivers and it's complex. But we won't get there by you sitting there and we sitting here and not talking. And what I'm is suggesting that we open the door to at least trying to see way through some of these problems. Thank you very much.